So welcome everyone to this Tyndall seminar. It's the second in a series called Climate Inequality and X. And today our focus is climate inequality and conservation. So the X is conservation, if you like. And last week was the first one of the series with a talk around climate inequality and adaptation. It's a four-part series and it's hosted by the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and Climate UEA. And just to quickly plug for next week's seminar, that's going to be organised by Sarah Mander from Tyndall Manchester, and it's going to focus on energy. And I'll just post the link into the chat so that you'll be able to register for that if it sounds compelling to you. But just to come back then to today's talk, the focus will be on themes such as inequality, justice, plural values in the context of climate conservation. And to give you some background to the talks, they come from the starting point that conservation interventions are increasingly blended with responses to climate change and have been through a rebranding in the form of nature-based solutions. So climate conservation interventions, or MBS, include things such as REDD+, forest landscape restoration, and integrated landscape initiatives, amongst others. And not only climate change then, but these interventions themselves also impact communities. And whilst climate conservation presents an opportunity for simultaneously tackling climate change, conservation and development, these interventions may also pose risks to local communities. And given the increasing interest in nature-based solutions in the international policy arena, it's imperative that these interventions don't extenuate the vulnerabilities of rural communities and instead enhance the resilience and well-being of those places and people that they impact. So ensuring the pursuit of climate-related conservation delivers equitable outcomes likely demands the design of interventions that resonate with place-based realities of local communities. And we hope in this seminar to reflect on some lessons learned from research and action and thinking around governance principles for climate conservation that's socially equitable. So today I'm the host, I'm Rachel Carmenta, I'm Tyndall Lecturer in Climate Change and International Development at UEA. And before I hand over, I'd like to introduce our speakers. And we've got two speakers this afternoon. The first speaker is Patti Balvanera, who is Professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM. And Patti was trained as an ecologist and has been exploring the different ways in which biodiversity is linked to human well-being with many inter- and transdisciplinary teams. She has led the Global Earth Observation Biodiversity Observation Network, which is a mouthful, the Ecosystem Services team, co-led the scientific committee of the Programme for Ecosystem Change and Society, and a Mexican network on social ecological systems, and is currently the co-chair of the values assessment for IPES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Patti is associate editor at a number of different journals, including Science Advances, People and Nature, Ecosystem Services, Ecology and Society, and member of the editorial board of Ecosystems and People. And then our second speaker will be Dr. Karen Wong Perez, who is a senior researcher in the Climate Change Research Group with the International Institute for Environment and Development, or IIED. Karen's work focuses on the justice dimensions of climate change. She works on a variety of issues related to climate, gender, and environmental justice. And her current work centres on exploring citizen engagement processes for socially just climate action, co-designing a collaborative initiative to enable increased access to climate finance for grassroots organisations, and examining enablers of equitable multi-stakeholder partnerships, and implementing site-level equity and governance assessments in Latin America. So the structure for this seminar will be 2 30-minute or so presentations, and each one followed by around 15 minutes for questions and discussion and reflections with you, the audience, and participants. And as we go through, please feel free to post your reflections and thinking or questions into the chat, because my colleague Mark Herbeth, who's here also with the Tyndall Centre and Dev, will be monitoring the chat and will be able to come back to any questions, hopefully come back to any questions that are posted there in the Q&A sessions. So I'm going to hand over to Patty, but due to power cuts in Mexico, I'm going to share my screen, so Patty, if you just tell me when to share.
Exactly.
When to switch.
I guess you can get started and see if it works.
Is hoping. Okay, so do you see my screen? Does anyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Patty, you...
As soon as, yeah, there we go. As soon as the computer allows, but it's allowing, so it's great. So now we're ready. And so I will be talking about this plural valuation of nature. So if you go to next one, please. So the first question is, why do people value nature? And a bit the way Rachel framed it is, why is nature being conserved or managed in particular ways? And this really changes across contexts and across stakeholders. Next. So I'm going to take you in a very personal journey. Go to next one. Yeah. In which the ways we have focused on nature and its conservation have really changed through time. So very early on in my career, we focused on richness of species. So what are the areas that share the largest diversity? And if you go to next one, I guess I put an animation, not counting on the power cuts. That makes it harder. And so in this case, we mapped the records found in herbaria and in museums, and to identify the areas that have the highest conservation value in terms of their species diversity. Next. In the following work, we built a database of experimental literature in which species richness had been manipulated and its impact on ecosystem function was measured. So in this case, the correlation between richness and function was measured as a way to assess the impacts of changes in richness in their functions, and we summarize them in terms of services. So if you see in the 1 would mean this, and -1 would be a negative effect. And you see that for most of the 446 measures grouped in different types of functions and services, the more richness, the more function. So next, in this case, the value of protecting biodiversity has to do with its links to functions and services. Yeah, this is fine, this is fine. So in another work later on, we analyzed the trends of recovery of secondary tropical forests and their contributions to carbon uptake. And these are simulations of how much carbon would be stored within 20 years in a range of tropical forests that were directly measured and then modeled. So in this case, next, it's really the value of nature, in this case of tropical forests, in terms of the carbon uptake, the carbon climate change mitigation value. Yeah, so what I'm going to do next is to do a tropical dry forest, no? And in this case, is really inquiring with local stakeholders, very specifically cattle ranchers, what are the ecosystem services they appreciate the most. And so you see in the x-axis, the ranked services, and in the y-axis, their frequency, and the size of the bubble is an importance index based on the frequency and the way they coded them. So you see that people value nature, these ranchers value nature in different ways, all the way from from provisioning services for pasture, for water, but also for aesthetic pleasure and for shade and so on. Next. So, and here, if you do 3 times, Rachel, we have the different values. Let's do it once. Yeah, the next one. Thanks. So in a way, we also started reflecting on the value of nature in this context of conservation. And there was a tension between those focusing on intrinsic value, so the value of nature independently of people, or instrumental value, which were associated to these ecosystem services and nature bringing people particular pleasure, satisfaction, or meeting their needs. But there's really another way to see nature, which are the relational values. And these relational values are about the importance of nature in relation to who I am and how I relate to others. So the relational values with people and the relationships between people in the context of nature. Next. So this has really taken on in the literature, and in a relatively recent note, Berta Martin Lopez summarized this. You have the intrinsic, instrumental, and relational values, and you have very different types of values involved. In terms of intrinsic, is basically the amount of biodiversity or characteristics. Instrumental can be food and energy. Relational, you have different types of connections, and different types of actors are linked to these different types of values. For instance, in intrinsic would be maybe environmentalist or conservationist, but instrumental would be the people benefiting from nature, and relational will be different types of communities that are very connected to nature, and their everyday identities and livelihoods depend. And these different types of values can be elicited using very different methods, all the way from biophysical, economic, or sociocultural in the case of relational values. Next. And so these different types of values matter because, what I wanted to say is these different types of values are not taken into account in the same way in decisions. Here we see that, as we all know, there's a small handful of corporations that concentrate large shares of operations around the world that take advantage of fisheries, forests, mining, and so on. And so we see that their values really dominate the decisions, and this very instrumental perspective of nature dominate. Next one. And it's not only about whose values dominate, but who wins and who loses. So for instance, in the context of the global assessment, we analyzed in the x-axis the changes in GDP per capita for different types of countries over a period of more than 20 years. And in the y-axis, the changes in biodiversity intactness index. And we can see in the lower left that low-income countries, which are the ones in red, have seen the lowest increases in GDP per capita, but at a very high cost in their biodiversity. And if we go to the opposite, to the upper right corner, the high-income countries show the highest gains, and at not even a cost in their biodiversity, but even a recovery. So really, the way we relate to nature is very unequal. Next one. And basically, I mean, there's huge conflicts that arise because the voices and the values held by local people and the burdens are taken from them. So their voices are not heard, and they take on all the burdens. They do not take most of the benefits. And there's a clash between these different values, and that results from trying to deal with these huge power imbalances. Next one. Of nature and why worry about these diverse values and the how. Thank you. I'm going to tell you about a project with Rachel in terms of the plural evaluation finance Earth and the Natural Assets Knowledge Action Network on assessing the equitable valuation of nature. Next. And so what we did was to identify a range of sites across the global south. And we focus explicitly on the global south because power imbalances are particularly strong in these cases, and the very unequal gains and burdens are very clear. And we gathered a team of people that were already analyzing, assessing different plural evaluation in very different contexts to analyze what was this about. Next one. So we held a series of workshops in different parts of the world to think together about this. Next one. And basically we iteratively developed an analytical framework about how does plural evaluation work. And so, for instance, we identified the purposes of plural evaluation, whether more exploratory or more policy-oriented. We identify the different metrics and variables that characterize these plural evaluations. So whether they use different metrics or whether they recognize trade-offs between the different ecosystem services or contributions from nature. Next one. We also identified the variables that were used to assess the inputs from plural evaluation into case studies. So for instance, whether conflicts and synergies were revealed. And we also analyzed the different variables that were used to assess the social ecological outcomes from plural evaluation. For instance, the improved flows of nature's contributions to people, or whether conflicts were reduced. Next. And so what was the outcome of this exploration? Next one. So basically, we identified that the search for plural evaluation, or say the recognition of how very diverse values of nature are held and their very asymmetric power relations among them, this search has really come from a wide range of disciplines, and many people are really converging around the need to address these issues, all the way from negotiation management, environmental ethics, social ecological systems, and so on. Next one. We define plural evaluation as a process of knowledge generation that seeks to inform decision-making and actions which affect human-nature relations. by considering stakeholders' diverse values. And basically, this is about eliciting, describing, and analyzing the diversity of values held by different stakeholders and assessing the actual or potential impacts of these decisions on people and nature. And what we found that is very critical is this plural evaluation can be used as a negotiation support tool. Next one. So drawing from the analysis of our case studies, we built an analytical processes, and we came as a conclusion to an analytical framework that is shown here, where in the top part of the figure, you see the trigger, and these triggers could be conflicts, could be different kind assessment needs and so on, which then leads to plural evaluation that can be undertaken for different purposes and for different approaches. And the results of these plural evaluations can then be included explicitly into decision-making processes. And if we continue, then these can also be used in negotiation and really more iterative decisions, not just a one occasion, just a single opportunity. And then this really leads to social ecological outcomes. And these can really feedback again and again. And we also analyze the enablers and constraints for plural evaluation to be explicitly incorporated into decision-making and for the outcomes of negotiation being favorable in terms of social and ecological terms. Next one. And if you can do it twice, please. So what we did is that we clustered the different case studies, and what we found is that there was a cluster where those studies that were policy or action oriented and they were were participatory really stood out relative to the other ones. Next one. And yeah, if you do, I think we need, yeah, another one, please. Just one less. Yeah, thanks. So what we see in this, and so by analyzing the spread of the case studies, and in the x-axis, we analyze the social equity and ecological sustainability of the outcomes of this plural evaluation process. And on the y-axis, the role of plural evaluation being incorporated explicitly in decisions. We see there are some case studies that actually comply with both, but most of those case studies were spread out in different conditions. And in order to really have the best outcomes and the inclusion of plural evaluation decision, it's very important to include marginalized values to reveal conflicts and synergies, and to use plural evaluation as a tool to open the door for marginalized stakeholders and to reconcile cognitive models and to communicate about these different perspectives. Next one. So what have we learned from this and what comes next? So next slide. So and can you do the second one, please, Rachel? So in the context of the best values assessment, plural evaluation actually was considered as a key leverage point for the transformative change needed to address the current biodiversity crisis. So you see in the left, we have multiple stakeholders, and the idea is to have them participate in interventions that are participatory. In the right, we see how, of course, these changes will impact the way nature is being managed, and so its impact on the direct and indirect drivers. But what we see in the leverage points is that these issues of values and to really unleashing those, making visible the diversity of values and unleashing those values like the relational values that really foster care for nature are particularly important. Next. And so these ideas are now being developed in the context of the IPBES values assessment. IPBES is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And we started working in 2018, and by mid-2022, this assessment will be presented to the IPBES plenary for its approval. And we have a very large team of people that are actually analyzing the diverse values of nature, how they are or not incorporating into decisions, and how they play a key role in more desirable futures and in transformative change. Next one. And in a way, with a team of authors, we have really discussed that this issue plural evaluation goes beyond just a mere academic exercise. No, it's about committing to really transform institutions that determine the ways in which values is nature. And we came up with this idea of octopi, no, from occupy, like the strategy of collaborative and constructive occupation, but an octopus, which we have a diverse and semi-autonomous and yet connected initiatives, and to really work in this octopi strategy to make plural evaluation a very important strategy at very different levels to make voices heard and to transform the institutions that do not allow certain voices to be heard. Next one. So if we now go in the context of nature-based solutions, I mean, there's many efforts along these sides, but if we see the emphasis in nature-based solutions has largely been in terms of the biophysical conditions, no? The coastal defense, the cooling and shading, the flood and erosion control, and even when the people are considering is about how nature contributes to livelihoods or to cultural values or social capital. Next. But in a paper that actually came up this week, there's an emphasis that these nature-based solutions address particular challenges. We have different types of nature-based solutions, and the outcomes are about balancing biodiversity, nature's contribution to people, and good quality of life. But here they show how much values and the different types of knowledge and worldviews of people are just as important as the biophysical aspects that underpin these nature-based solutions. So these solutions are as much people-based as they are nature-based. Next. So in this diagram, and maybe you can do all of them, Rachel. I think you need to do 5. Yeah, thank you. So if we combine like this recent paper with our perspective of plural evaluation, one important way to think about a nature-based solution is start by assessing the challenges that trigger this solution, but from the perspectives of the different stakeholders. The second would be really eliciting the values of nature and these nature-based solutions that are held by the different types of stakeholders, not just the dominant ones. The third would be to explicitly include the different values and their worldviews, their knowledge, and their voices of the different stakeholders in the decisions about nature-based solutions. The following one would be to really think widely in the negotiation and decision-making processes. So really recognizing and reconciling the different cognitive models about these nature-based solutions in the negotiation process. And finally, to monitor and to be very mindful of how these social ecological outcomes of nature-based solutions affect differentially different stakeholders. Next one. So in synthesis, from this talk, for the COP26, what we can say is that unless we recognize and explicitly take into account the very diverse ways in which people value nature, nature-based solutions will not be long-lasting nor fair. And the next one, that will be all, and thank you so much, and I'm happy to take your comments and questions.
Great, thank you, Patty. That was a really interesting talk, and lots of content. So, you know, I wanted to take in all those diagrams, and my mind is still still racing. So thank you for that. Does anyone have a question that they would like to post, or to feel free to also raise your hand and come onto the mic? But maybe while people are just collecting their thoughts, I'd be interested, Patty, to hear if you have an example of a case, or, you know, of an action, a nature-based solution, whether it's RED or a PES or another type of intervention, has managed to support those relational values. If you just maybe talk about a case that you know, or if an example, you know, how they've gone around doing that in terms of part of their actions.
Right. So I think many of us are working, for example, in so I've been working for a long time in trade-offs with forests, and really managing forests in ways that both provide nature-based solutions, but also support livelihoods and take into account people. So for instance, this push for agroforestry or agroforestry systems, and diverse ones, are very interesting examples when they are built together with people. So for instance, we are working in the Lacandon forest in an area where there's been a lot of research and protection, but voices of people have not been heard. So now we are collaborating with artists and departing from the kitchen by cooking together and sharing our interest in food, we start identifying the role of forest and the role of the way food is grown in terms of their livelihoods and implications for nature. And based on those efforts, we are starting to co-develop these food forests that have a series of impacts, for people in terms of providing a set of ecosystem services, supporting their livelihoods, but also being very important for climate regulation. And this effort is really about not imposing this idea, but rather building it together from underground conversations where their links to nature and their perspectives are actually revealed in a very informal setting, through cooking, through working together in these food forests.
Great, thank you. I'll follow up on with other questions about it, but I'm going to hand over to Mark because I see his hand is raised.
Hello, Patty. Thanks very much for a really, really fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could reflect perhaps on the role of inequality and how that either influences the way that people value nature. So when you were talking about plural valuations, either the role of inequality in terms of determining the valuations that people have, or thinking about how inequality can maybe lead to conflict within those valuations, please.
Yeah, so I mean, any individual, any of us values nature in very different ways, depending the context we are in. So this diversity of values is already there for most of the people, and it really depends on your everyday experience and your everyday needs, the kinds of things you value about nature. And the role of inequality is the fact that, on the one hand, depending on the way you have access to nature or your rights are respected, it really changes your links to nature in terms whether it can support your livelihoods or not. But the role of inequality has really a lot to do with two things: with the outcomes, so who loses and who wins, and also the other part is who makes the decision, because as academics, we can maybe say, oh, yes, I will take into account this and design a process to make the voices heard. But it's really decision makers on the ground who are designing the decision-making processes and deciding how to include or not the different voices. So I think inequality will value nature, but it definitely impacts whose voices are taken into account and what outcomes are considered, because if the range of outcomes for different people are not taken into account, then these will not be explicitly included in the negotiation process. I'm not sure if that's clear.
It is, yeah, super. Thanks very much.
Oh, I see there's a question in the chat, but I'll read that in a second. Picking up on Mark's question, Patty, I was just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of, what are the main barriers to a more widespread use of plural valuation in both designing interventions, but also in measuring the impacts of them. What do you think those main barriers are?
Right. So we did analyze the barriers in these 9 case studies, and in the value assessments, we are analyzing more, so that will come soon. And so basically, it seems that overall, the way institutions are set in a particular place have to do with how decisions are made and whose voices are brought to the table. So if I go to this example in the Lacandon forest, I mean, decisions about this forest are taken globally. No, the Global Environmental Facility decides on which protected areas to do where and which ones to support at the national scale too. No, so there's the forest is conserved based on national policies, and this particular forest, for instance, has really been supported by several very affluent players that are pushing for conservation. So fine, I mean, there it's a very important area for conservators. Really not even the decisions about agriculture are taken at the regional or the national scales where they have very little voices, no? And so what we're trying to do in these transdisciplinary projects is really allow for mechanisms for people to express their voices in ways that also that are amenable to the way they do things. No, if we come and say, oh, can you tell me what you think? And in a very impositive way, I mean, how much can we really understand what they want? So we really integrate into their everyday life, and from their everyday life and from just cooking or growing food together, we really make them visible and show what are their needs and what are their voices, and make them visible to then take them to other decision-making arenas.
Great, thank you. Perhaps the last question from Roger. Roger, I don't know if you want to take the mic, or I can ask. Well, oh, here we go.
Hi there. Actually, there's another question in the chat as well. It's just popped in.
Yeah, I just saw that.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Patty. I'm hang on to put my camera on. Right. Hi there.
Hello.
Yeah, I just, it's just recognizing that when you have multiple voices and you listen to the voices of those, particularly, groups that are perhaps poorer groups that may not have purely positive perceptions about conservation, and it's recognizing that there may be viewpoints that run counter to even to the idea of strength and protection, what we might think of as a sustainable management, in that you know, and it's this recognition that we think of ecosystem services almost purely in a positive way, but the natural environment may create problems for local communities, and with human wildlife conflict, of course, around crop losses, around predation on livestock, and risks to people themselves are, you know, quite commonplace problems around protected areas, and often for which there's inadequate compensation. So it's recognizing plural voices is going to also bring out some quite uncomfortable things for mainstream conservation. And I wondered if you could reflect on that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, if I go back to this Lacanau forest example, mainstream conservation is a global agenda. I mean, it's about, yes, this biodiversity is so important globally, or even a national agenda. From people living in the cities worrying about this biodiversity, which of course is very important, but everyday life of people, they do recognize the importance of this biodiversity, but they have to really, quote unquote, fight with it. No, I mean, when they arrive, there's all these snakes, and the jaguars come and eat their chicken, and they need to make an everyday living. So I think what plural evaluation also allows the conservation community to think about people. What are their needs? What are their relations to these nature-based solutions, or to conservation, or to these what is in for them? No, because from the academia, we tend to think about this intervention as all having to converge into conservation, and everybody having to support this conservation. But there's really a wide range of perspectives and motivations. Of course, if we go the other way around in terms of mining, conservationists would say, yes, we all align and we don't want mining. And for conservation, we're not so open to hear what local people have to say about how conservation affects their livelihoods, and how do they feel about this biodiversity. So for instance, in that case, people arrived in the area 40 years ago only, and biodiversity is part of their lives, and the existence of this conserved area is part of their lives. But on the other hand, they need to have a living and to produce. And so how to reconcile this in ways that are respectful of their needs, no?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patty. There is another question in the chat from Megan, but maybe we should switch now to
Okay.
in the interest of time. Patty, I don't know if via your device you can respond in the chat, but otherwise maybe.
Okay, yes, I will try. Thank you, and thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you ever so much. Karen, I've made you the host, so you should be able to share your screen, and
yeah,
I'll hand over to you.
Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. I am really thrilled to be here. The University of East Anglia is a pioneer in environmental justice research and climate justice research, and I am very excited to have the chance to share this space with you all. And Patricia has talked about the importance of value plurality, and this is very relevant within the conceptions of environmental and climate justice. So I think that what I will share with you reinforces the importance of value plurality as a way, one of the dimensions of justice, the recognition. My presentation is structured in 3 parts. I will first briefly reflect on the interconnected nature of inequality, which is aggravated by the nature and climate crisis. The second part presents environmental justice framework as a possible way for analyzing some of the challenges in addressing all the 3 problems together: inequality, biodiversity loss, and climate change. And finally, I focus on sharing some of the collaborative initiatives that IIED is advancing in partnership with other organizations, including in UEA, to achieve locally just and equitable solutions for climate adaptation and conservation actions. So since last year, we are still facing the unequal impact of COVID-19. The pandemic demonstrated the disproportionate impacts for groups that are already vulnerable to disasters. As we all know, climate change is deeply intertwined with global patterns of inequality and is interlinked clearly with nature and biodiversity loss. The unequal, the injustice is originated from the fact that most vulnerable people bear the brunt of the climate change impacts, yet contribute the least to the crisis. But also the most vulnerable are often disproportionately impacted by the costs of addressing climate change and adapting to climate change. So sometimes climate adaptation and mitigation responses can place a higher financial burden on already vulnerable individuals and groups. And this makes climate change a social justice issue. At the same time, we witness the rapid loss of nature, which directly increases vulnerability because to climate change, pandemic disasters, and conflicts, again, with the most marginalized and vulnerable hit first and hardest. And this includes not only people in our generation, but future generations as well. And if we want to expand our understanding of the community of justice, this includes non-human nature, non-human species as well. This makes biodiversity loss as a social, environmental, and ecological justice issue. Here I just quote the IPCC's report that show a growing evidence about the interdependency of climate and biodiversity crisis. Last year, during the London Climate Action Week, IIED hosted an event around inequality of how COVID-19 has aggravated inequality. And during the webinar, leaders from grassroots networks and social movements exposed the way in which COVID-19 has aggravated multiple pre-existing inequalities. And this is the word cloud that was generated in the webinar, where you can see the multidimensional aspect of inequality. You can see many interlocked development goals here: gender, health, economic, poverty, food security. And if we link with biodiversity, the IPCC report also highlights that biodiversity underpins the delivery of many SDGs, food security, resilience, livelihoods, and employment. So if we link these multidimensional inequalities with biodiversity loss, also in the World Economic Forum this year ranked biodiversity loss as a global existential threat alongside weapons of mass destruction and state collapses. Also, another World Economic Forum report found that over half of the world's total GDP, around $44 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. All this is to highlight the fact that biodiversity loss and climate change are inseparable threats to humanity that must be addressed together. This year, we have a very good opportunity to break the silos and address climate and nature together. As you know, there are huge expectations this year, which some people refer to as the super year for climate and nature. The meetings in preparation for the CBD COP15 are underway and will meet this October in China. This is a good opportunity to have a strong and implementable framework because none of the Aichi biodiversity targets were met. And in November, we have the UNFCCC COP26 that will focus on countries increasing the ambition of their commitments to tackle the climate emergency. In all these areas, there is a risk of trying to solve the same problems in the same way as before and expecting different results. In conservation, raising ambition without paying attention to justice and equity issues have derived in efforts based on post-colonial models and fortress conservation approaches that have had very negative impacts for indigenous and local communities. And in responses to climate change, we see stark inequalities in the distribution of resources to the most vulnerable countries, inequalities in the distribution of resources between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, inequality in the distribution of resources that effectively reach the local level. What this tells us is that tackling both issues together need responses that pay careful attention to justice and equity dimensions. And by that, I mean to the distributional aspect, to procedure, and to recognitional aspects, and incorporate indigenous and local knowledge, devolving decision-making power to the local actors, for example, among others. So why examining climate and conservation action through a justice and equity lens? There are at least 3 reasons. One is the intrinsic reasons, aiming to have just and fair societies, and just and fair climate and conservation responses have a value in itself. And these intrinsic reasons are protected by a variety of normative frameworks. For example, a key principle of the sustainable goals is to leave no one behind. So that means that no goal is considered to be met unless it is met for everyone. And clearly this is linked to distribution dimensions and recognition and procedural dimensions as well. The CBD has equity considerations too, and the UNFCCC Paris Agreement includes the terms climate justice, fairness, and equity, mostly through the principles of common burdens, differentiated responsibilities. Instrumental reasons relates to social feedbacks affecting effectiveness of outcomes. In conservation, some authors have highlighted the role of feedbacks or negative equity feedbacks that originate from a perception of unfairness, and that perception of unfairness triggers reduced project legitimacy, non-participation, active resistance, corruption, all of them with implications to both efficiency and effectiveness of responses. And also, some authors point out that empowered local people, reduced economic inequalities, and maintaining cultural and livelihood benefits increase the likelihoods of positive conservation outcomes. A third reason that I particularly like is Amartya Sen's definition of constructive reasons as the ones that help us to shape societal values and aspirations. And here in the constructive reasons is that attention is placed on the process itself of examining issues through an equity and justice lens. So sharing and contesting idea of what this means allows us to examine our own assumption of who are the members of the community of justice, what do we owe to others, what do we owe to future generations and non-human nature. And I will start by describing all the challenges in the local action through these environmental justice frameworks. So some of you might be very familiar with this environmental justice framework from Schlossberg in 2007. It has 3 dimensions of justice. This framework has been essential for the development of a variety of adapted frameworks suited for different purposes. This framework includes distribution, procedure, and recognition as dimensions of environmental justice. Distribution concerns on how and what gets distributed in the construction of a just society. Justice and recognition puts emphasis on the underlying causes of maldistribution and exclusion, and is based on an understanding of who, what groups are systematically excluded, and considerations of valuing different knowledge systems. Adrian Martin, for example, and others highlight the importance of these dimensions as a precondition to the other 2. The procedural justice concerns how decisions are made, who is involved, and who has influence in decision-making processes. Yes. This is the Equity for Protected Area Conservation Framework that was developed in the context of biological conservation. It responds to a variety of goals to ensure that equity is highlighted in protected areas conservation. The CBD 14 adopted the voluntary guidance and used this framework on effective governance models, including the 3 dimensions of recognition, procedure, and distribution, and includes the aspect of enabling conditions. And this is the framework that IID is using, and the one that I am using too in the presentation to structure all the messages in locally led adaptation responses. So you might notice that I'm using interchangeably the words equity and justice, and I wanted to clarify what these terms mean, or what are the debates around these terms. From the political theory tradition, justice has been defined in terms of rights or in terms of adherence to a moral right. In this sense, the term justice is perceived as holding more universalistic and static meaning. By contrast, equity is comparative. So it's relational. It requires comparison between two entities by specific criteria. McDermott in 2013 uses a metaphor to explain the rationale about the difference between justice and equity. And she says that if we consider a justice as a blindfolded woman holding scales and a sword to ensure equal treatment for all, equity has her eyes wide open to identify this relational and comparison aspect. Now, starting with the analysis of the distribution dimension of justice for climate and nature action at the local level, we can see that climate finance is not balanced, as agreed under the Paris Agreement, with adaptation finance at 20% of overall climate finance flows. Only 14 and 2% of climate finance is going to least developed countries and small island developing states. And this is highly worrying because they are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. If we focus the analysis on the local level, which is the main focus of the presentation, we see that less than 10% of the global climate finance is committed to the local level. So this tells us that money is not getting where it matters. It's not reaching the people and places who need funding the most. Upcoming IIED research shows, for example, the case of the GCF, the world's largest climate funds, that has 70% of the projects and programs within its portfolio are channeled through international actors. So there are many layers of intermediation that creates confused messages around success and challenges, and that is not allowing climate finance reach the local level. In the biodiversity financial gaps, research by the Nature Conservancy and 15 other institutions highlight financial gaps as well. Griscom's paper in 2017 reports that nature-based solutions can provide up to 37% of the emission reductions needed by 2030, but they only have 3% of international climate finance, with the bulk of the finance going to cut emissions from energy use. What this tells us is that the unequitable distribution highlights the need to raise ambition, not only in the quantity of finance, but in the way it is distributed. And it also underscores the importance of finance reaching the countries and the local communities, which are bearing the brunt of climate change impacts. In the procedural justice dimension, as you remember, the procedural justice referred to decision-making processes, specifically how decisions are made, who is involved, and who has influence. In climate and conservation responses, these reflect the level of power and influence that citizens have in decision-making. And this is important because responding to the interconnected challenges of inequality, biodiversity loss, and climate change requires mechanisms that enable people to engage actively in policy and decision-making. So what are the barriers and enablers for the meaningful engagement of local actors? To answer this question, with funding from the World Bank, last year, IIED and 3 grassroots networks in Kenya, Malawi, and Uganda conducted research to answer this question in a project engaging citizens for socially just climate action. The report is upcoming. But in summary, what we found is that social inequalities make it very difficult for people to participate meaningfully in public decisions. And the reason is that individuals engage in participatory spaces with very unequal resources, capabilities, unequal access to information, communication skills, different sense of entitlement, different familiarity with technical knowledge, and different socioeconomic status. So we cluster the challenges for the meaningful engagement of citizens into different categories. Unequal presence, that basically there are no spaces, they are not invited to, the opportunity costs are too high for them to participate. But also, even when there are some spaces for participation, there's a lack of political voice. And we use the term of political capabilities to identify this inequality that comes from the lack of information, the lack of sense of entitlement, the lack of self-confidence that in action, in practice, represents unequal political voice. And also unequal power to influence decisions and challenges of representation at greater scales. The fact that people need to rely with representatives that not necessarily represent equitably all the constituents in a community is a source of a challenge and are prone to elite capture. At the same time, we identify some of the qualities of inclusive or some corrective measures that can be taken to balance these challenges for the meaningful engagement of citizens. And these include investing in reducing the gap in individual and collective political capabilities, securing access to information, climate information services, and reducing the digital gap. And from the public space is designing inclusive public spaces and be willing to engage in long-term collaborative governance arrangements over longer timeframes. So instead of seeing the citizen engagement as discrete processes, to engage in social learning processes that are sustained over time. From the recognition side, as you remember, the recognition dimension has to do with valuing different knowledge systems, valuing different cultural differences. And this comes from the fact that many cases of injustice originates from the lack of recognition to cultural differences in value systems, different source of knowledge. And in the context of climate and conservation, what we know is that indigenous knowledge systems can provide useful lessons on how to effectively design and implement nature-based solutions, but the knowledge and rights continue to be marginalized and disregarded. From our project with engaging pastoralist communities through citizen movements to amplify their voice, we documented the ways in which combining traditional knowledge with science has been key to develop successful nature-based solutions and community resilience. Working with the Parent Alliance, it's a network of pastoralist communities in Kenya. We documented the way in which Kwaso Trostland, for example, combined traditional and technical climate information. They have a partnership with the National Drought Management Authority, and they use community weather monitors that combine metadata coming from the NDMA with traditional knowledge being generated within the community, and that rely in their indigenous methods of weather forecasting. And they disperse this merged combined information to the community using various means, including local radio, which broadcasts in local languages, and informal social gatherings and ward level meetings. Another part of the recognition challenge is to shift the narratives of representation of local communities and traditionally marginalized groups from passive beneficiaries to knowledge holders, active agents with agency and human dignity. Our research shows that communities bring unique perspectives, skills, and a wealth of knowledge to the challenge of strengthening resilience and addressing climate change. That they should be engaged as equal partners in resilience building rather than being regarded as merely beneficiaries. And the World Bank research experience have shown that community leaders can set priorities, influence ownership, and design and implement investment programs that are responsive to their community's own needs. So how to overcome these equity and justice related challenges for locally led action? Different organizations are better placed to move action at a specific level or at different intersections. A systemic approach of multi-sectoral partnerships that place equity and justice dimensions at the core of climate and conservation action is needed to move from business as usual to move to business unusual and redressing the unequal power dynamics that are the core of unequal recognition and unequal distributions and a lack of political voice. So in this last part, I will share some of the collaborative initiatives that IIED and its partners are advancing to achieve equitable solutions at the local level. I will start with the principles for locally led action, which can be seen as part of the enabling conditions that are needed to change the way in which development actors and donors can support local stakeholders to lead adaptation. The principles were developed by a partnership formed under the Global Commission on Adaptation and included IID and the World Resources Institute. They were developed over a 2-year stakeholder engagement process. On January this year, the locally led adaptation principles were launched during the Climate Adaptation Summit. And so far, more than 40 governments, leading global institutions, and local and international NGOs have already endorsed these principles. The importance of locally led adaptation action was highlighted in the Global Commission on Adaptation's 2019 flagship report, Adapt Now. And under this track, the locally led action track, the principles were developed by the partners. There are 8 principles that provide criteria to a range of actors who can commit to these principles and change their practices towards those that are more equitable and sustainable. You can see here the 8 principles. It starts with the devolution of decision-making to the lowest possible level, as close as possible to those most affected by the climate crisis. It includes the meaningful community engagement in decision makings, solution prioritization, and MEL. So involves engaging people not only at the implementation stage, but at the design stage of solutions. The second is addressing structural inequalities. So this principle includes strengthening local and excluded people's participatory and leadership skills, addressing development deficits, and addresses issues of land rights and power, and commits to consider underlying power dynamics and imbalances. The third principle is to provide simpler access and patient and predictable funding. Also extending the time frame of funding and learning, most to the long term, over 7 years, for example. The third is around investing in local institution legacies. So this refers to building, strengthening local institutions that are agile and can provide flexible finance behind local priorities. So this contracts the fly-in, fly-out consultant, global north consultants that are models. The fourth is around building robust understanding of climate risk and uncertainty, and this links very particularly with the recognition side, because it encompasses ensuring that climate science is developed in a participatory manner, combined with traditional indigenous climate knowledge to create sustainable local climate solutions. Principle 6 refers to flexible programming, that is, go beyond the log frames and results-based that prompts us to read the future, and rather recognize that occasional failure is a crucial part of learning and committing to adaptive management and more flexible planning processes. Radical transparency and accountability means that donors and financing mechanisms are willing to provide full transparency and reporting how much funding makes its way to the local level, because it has been quite challenging to understand the level of finance that reaches effectively the local level. And that is because of the lack of transparency of donors. And the 8th principle is around converged action and collaboration, integrated solutions. This speaks about the integration of biodiversity, climate and development, and humanitarian finance to build capabilities, enabling environments, and deliver investments over the long term. At the start of this year, IID and those committed to the principles embarked on a 10-year learning journey to promote locally led adaptation, and we will use 3 annual events: the Gobeshona Conference held in Bangladesh every January, the Community-Based Adaptation Conference in summer, in June, and the Development and Climate Days, to grow a community of practice that will demonstrate the role and value of locally led adaptation action. The next learning space is at CBA, the Community-Based Adaptation Conference, will be totally online. If you want to join, the registration is open at IIED website. Another collaborative initiative that we are advancing with equity and justice dimensions at the core is the Frontline Fund's Accelerator. It's a partnership between the Global Resilience Partnership, Waru Commission, a grassroots women networks coalition, the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, Slum Dwellers International, and IIED. And the aim of this initiative is to support grassroots-led funding mechanisms that place resources in the hands of organized community groups. The Frontline Fund's accelerators plan to support grassroots groups to build governance and operational capacities to handle larger grants to scale their initiatives, build awareness of donors, and also build trust among donors for these initiatives, create spaces for social learning, and build coalitions across constituency-led grassroots movements. All the design of this process is underpinned by justice dimensions. The long-term vision speaks directly to strengthening voice and agency and influence, recognition, procedure, and strengthen individual and collective capabilities. What we aim to do is to magnify the presence and voice of grassroots network in the climate change space. We shape development and climate architecture and secure the right of participation of grassroots organizations, and secure that the climate finance reaches the local level. In the biodiversity conservation space, and trying to incentivize the enabling conditions for equity and justice at the local level, a new IIED guide offers negotiators practical steps for embedding equity in the global biodiversity framework. IIED is very keen to ensure that the final post-2020 global biodiversity framework places equity and justice considerations front and center. And we are concerned about target 2 of the target to protect 30% of the world's land by 2030, which, unless implemented with the full consent, participation, and leadership of indigenous peoples, could be disastrous. So the origin of this guide is particularly those kind of concerns. And the guide provides very practical advice to negotiators on current framings of the GBF that runs the risk of indigenous peoples to be squeezed off their land, and the guide provides alternative text for different targets, introducing equity all along the framework. And finally, moving to the global normative arena, to initiatives that place equity considerations at the local level. Some of you might be familiar with this initiative, as the UAE is a partner of IIED alongside with 18 organizations. It's the Site Level Assessment for Governance and Equity, or SAGE. This is a collaborative initiative. It's a rapid methodology for analyzing the governance and equity of protected areas and other effective conservation measures. It's conducted by own partners at site level, and the stakeholders themselves evaluate the quality and fairness of governance based on their experience with governance arrangements. The objective is to improve the governance and equity of conservation efforts, and we're planning to apply the same framework to climate and EBA nature-based solutions as well. That's part of the plan for this year. It provides qualitative and quantitative information for improving site-level governance arrangements, has this constructive role that I described earlier of engaging people in these deliberations of what this means for them, improves participants' understanding of governance and equity, and it's closely linked to the equity principles based on and governance principles of IUCN. So far, we have had two rounds of pilots. We are now waiting for the outcomes in Bolivia, the first time that this will be implemented in indigenous territory, and Honduras. The SAGE principles are paired with, again, with the 3 dimensions of justice and with IUCN principles of good governance. And these are just examples of how the SAGE works. It's similar to the MET in the application. Some examples of the report that are discussed based on perceptions of stakeholders, and the aggregated average responses in a spider, right? And finally, just to sum up everything, I wanted to close with some key messages, but before that, I wanted to remark that the environmental justice framework that is paying attention to dimensions of recognition, distribution, procedural justice, and also rights and duties is useful as an analytical lens to examine how to deliver equitable solutions for climate adaptation and conservation action at the local level. Some of the outcomes that we can expect, or we should expect from the COP, from the distribution side, we need to scale up finance for adaptation and resilience and deliver finance at the local level according to local needs and priorities. From the recognition side and procedural side, we need to enable locally led actions by people and communities most affected by climate impacts and ensure the full and effective participation of indigenous and other traditionally marginalized individuals and groups. From the effectiveness side, we need to integrate nature-based solutions into national planning and investing to drive resilience for both local communities and environment. And lastly, from the operational side, we need to walk the talk. We need to propel implementation, avoid what happened with the Aichi biodiversity targets, and truly promote more multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral collaboration with organizations that also share the interest of placing intrinsic value to equity and justice considerations, and who are willing to place them at heart of their actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was a really comprehensive talk and also a nice insight into different activities and projects and collaborations happening in IIED. I can see there's there's some questions in the chat, maybe also comment. It's Roger, would you like to take the mic, and if you're there?
I'm here, yes, change location. Hi there, thanks very much, Karen. Good to speak to you again. And my question is, I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, you know, and I'm hoping that we're going to get the chance very soon to work together on justice and conservation issues, but we'll wait and see what happens.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
But I have to say, and I would address this to Patty as well, if that's okay. You know, I think as we triggered watching the news, actually, and there's one thing, you know, when we talk about it in academic circles, but this message that, you know, this message, we must work together on climate change and biodiversity. We must do those two. And as someone who works, yes, in the connection of those two, but also in relation to inequality and into the social dimensions of environmental justice, I sort of think, well, that's a viewpoint. I mean, why could one not say, just as equally, we must deal with climate change in complete integration with poverty reduction, or with, you know, reduction of conflict, recognizing the interlinkages between climate change and all of those. So I suppose if you do endorse that position of that there's something particular about the need to address climate change and biodiversity together, why is that so, why is that logic so compelling?
Thanks, Roger. I think that one of the, as the IPBES report highlights, nature underpins most of the, it is the base for underpinning different development goals. So addressing biodiversity and nature together, and biodiversity loss is frequently not as charismatic and has not received as much support as the climate crisis. So linking both together is more like a strategic move, I will say, to address both crises and elevate the urgency to respond to the biodiversity crisis as well as to the climate change. So if we think in more systemic way, we're not saying these two should be the only ones that need to be tackled together. If we think this as a systemic, and I really like Kate Broward's representation of how nature is at the bottom and then everything is on the like in a pyramid. We see that everything is a system. So we work with urban and rural issues interconnected. So approaching all the problems, not in silos, but in a systemic way. It's not like only nature and climate. It's nature and climate because that's the core of all the other relations and other social problems that are needed to be tackled simultaneously. So I think it's more like a communication mechanism. I think that in research, action research organizations like IID try to have that balance of the academic precision of the nuance to the messages that will have more political traction. And in this year, with the COP 2015, the COP 15, the CBD COP 15 and COP 26, it's strategic to highlight and have these very political and clear messages to policymakers that we need to integrate both.
Okay.
And I think that the academics should be, not should, but needs to have this nuanced and these understandings that can, again, allow for other simplifications that have this distraction and political will.
I wonder as well, what is there to gain for the biodiversity or conservation community through that coupling of those two agendas, or, coming together? Because recently speaking with Asha Mins, who's communications director at the Tyndall Centre, and reflecting on how climate change as a sector, or as an endeavour, has really made perhaps more progress in terms of achieving impacts across scales than the conservation community has done. And Asha was reflecting on the role of climate change communication in all of that, because, well, partly because that's an observation which is valid, and also probably partly his bias since he's a communications person. But I wonder, through that marriage, if there's something to win for both endeavours. But also at the same time, that brings me on actually to something I wanted to speak to you about, Karen, which was in one of your later slides. You touched on nature needs 30 or 30 by 30. Nature needs half is also a sort of comparable lobbying momentum at the moment. And I just wondered if you could maybe talk a bit more about that, and if you see, what do you see as the dangers of using climate change as part of that momentum and as part of the validating of the argument for the need of nature needs 30, and the implications of 30 by 30.
Yeah, so when the IID recently published a couple of briefings on what the biodiversity group can, but the biodiversity folks or the processes can learn from the climate change. Okay. What the CBD can learn from COP 26 and the UNFCCC. And one is the kind of indicators and the kind of messages that are climate change using the metric of emissions is simplifies things. On the 30 by 30, one of the challenges is, as I mentioned, the issue of indigenous, the lack of respect to of indigenous and local groups, and Sorry, I lost the track of my thoughts. Could you repeat the question?
I was asking, what do you see are, some of the dangers, I suppose, the risks posed by the 30 by 30 movement, or the lobbying for that, and Nature Needs Half, which I think is sort of similar. But what do you think are the risks? Because you touched on it, but didn't go into any detail.
Yeah, well, one of the risks that are identified is the potential displacement, or the lack of respect. If we consider that most of the protected areas in certain areas are still depend on are inhabited by indigenous groups, and that the processes, post-colonial models of conservation and fortress conservation are embedded in political structures that are highly unequal and not necessarily have the same safeguards or have efficient implementation of social safeguards. If equity considerations are not put up at the heart, then there is a risk of continuing and perpetuating these models of conservation that have been quite harmful for indigenous groups. So bringing again issues of equity considerations in the framework will be essential. The IG targets had equity as well as the core, and now the framing in the current drafting is not as clear as in the previous framework. Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure that that's not only included as a normative approach, but also implemented.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Karen. Patty, do you have any, would you like to make any sort of reflection?
Sure. Thank you. Responding on this question about climate and biodiversity, from my perspective, it is really what has driven the climate issue was this idea of the life support systems. And the IPCC was launched back in 1982. And so it's been already, basically 40 years of synthesis and linking to these global audiences and many types of decision makers. So I think the success of the climate agenda has to do with both these 40 years of synthesis plus the 40 years of communication. And so from that perspective, the call for biodiversity is quite analogous. So IBES is the analogous to the IPCC that was born only in 2014. And it is already providing this very sound synthesis with 3,000 to 4,000 researchers from all over the globe participating. And the global assessment actually had a very wide audience, reaching billions of people in more than 150 different countries. So I think the momentum for biodiversity is coming. In terms of mechanism, I think they can not be dissociated. It's really nature that is regulating climate. It is the plants and the algae and so on. But the biodiversity agenda is much larger. I mean, it's not about just climate, it's about fisheries, it's about all these livelihoods that depend on the agrobiodiversity, on the forest and so on. So I think the agendas here are actually very interconnected. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to really build on the momentum by the climate community, and then to put very clearly the biodiversity agenda that today with COVID is more than obvious the role of biodiversity regulation in issues such as this pest regulation or the, we had more or less at the same time these locust invasions, and well, every day we have problems with the fisheries collapses and so on. So I think from my perspective, it's really building on the two communities. The two communities have some intersection, but are quite distinct in terms of agendas and the way they work. IBES is actually way more plural in the way the teams are conformed in terms of the regional balance, but also the disciplinary balance. And I think so the IPCC community has a lot to learn from these lessons, the advances of IBES in these few years. And I think the synergies are going to be amazing in terms of what IPCC has managed to do and what IBES has managed to do and how they can reinforce each other.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a very good last soundbite for this seminar. So, and we're a bit over time. So thank you so much for your contributions and all of the discussion in this time that we had together. It's been a really fascinating talk, and I wish we had longer, but hopefully we will continue exchanging ideas into the future. And thanks to everybody who's here to take part, and to people who helped organise, including Mark and also Tracy Hearn and April Dyer, who've been helping in the background as well. So thank you so much, folks, and thanks to everybody. Bye for now.
Bye for now. Thank you.